I grew up in a house where silence was safer than words. Our rooms were clean, the floors always shining, the curtains ironed and perfectly folded. My father used to say, "Order brings peace," but his peace was a kind that weighed on your chest, like something pressing you down until you couldn't breathe. He wasn't cruel in the way stories usually tell it. He didn't shout or slam doors, he didn't break things. He didn't have to. His power was quieter, the kind that lived in the way he looked at you, the way his voice could freeze the air without rising above a whisper. I remember once, when I was 7, I laughed too loudly at the dinner table. Just a laugh, that bright, innocent kind children are supposed to have. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't even look up right away. He just set the fork down, folded his hands, and said, "Do you find something funny while we're eating?" The room went cold. My mother looked at her plate. My sister's small fingers gripped her glass tightly. And I realized then, laughter was not allowed. Not that kind, not that free. I mumbled a soft, "No, sir," and the rest of the meal passed in silence. That was how rules worked in our home, unspoken yet absolute. You didn't learn them through words, you learned them through glances, through pauses, through that silent pressure that told you, "Stop before it's too late." I used to think other houses were the same. When I visited my friend Ethan's home after school, I'd sit in their living room and watch your parents talk, actually talk. They argued, they laughed, they touched each other's hands without fear. The sound of their house was alive. I didn't know homes could sound like that. Ethan once asked me, "Why are you so quiet all the time?" I said, "My dad doesn't like noise." He laughed like it was a joke, but it wasn't. Every sound in our house felt like it had to ask for permission, even footsteps on the stairs, even the ticking of the clock. I used to try and walk softer, breathe softer, just to make the silence happy. My father used to call it discipline. I called it invisible chains. The living room was his kingdom, dim with leather chairs that smelled of polish, a tall bookshelf filled with books no one ever touched, and that one clock that seemed louder at night. When he sat there in the evening reading his newspaper, no one dared to cross the line of his quiet. My mother would move like a ghost between the kitchen and the hallway. My sister and I stayed upstairs, pretending our toys were asleep. But silence has a way of seeping into your bones. It doesn't stop at your lips. It crawls inside you until you forget how to feel. I started to lose my voice without even realizing it. Not literally, I could speak, but I didn't know what to say anymore. Words felt dangerous. Emotions felt wrong. The strangest part was how normal it all seemed. On Sundays, when relatives came by, my father would become a different man. Calm, polite, even charming. They would say things like, "You're lucky to have such a disciplined home. Look at your children, so well behaved." My father would smile faintly and nod, and I would stand there beside him, quiet and proud. Proud because I thought obedience was love. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear my mother crying softly in the kitchen. I never told anyone. It felt like a secret I wasn't supposed to know. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she cried because of me. Maybe I disappointed him somehow. Maybe my silence wasn't enough. One winter night, I remember sneaking out of my room to get water. The house was dark except for the yellow light from under the living room door. My father was sitting there alone, his hand on his temple, a half-empty glass beside him. He looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. For a second, I felt sorry for him, like maybe his silence was a kind of pain too. But then he turned his head slightly, saw me in the doorway, and that softness vanished. "You should be asleep." "Yes, sir." "Do you know what time it is?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, holding the glass like a guilty thing. "Go back to bed." "Yes, sir." That was how every moment with him ended, with obedience. I never saw him as a bad man, just unreachable. Like there was a wall between him and the rest of us, built from years of his own unspoken rules. Maybe he thought he was protecting us from the world. Maybe he thought emotions were weakness. But the older I got, the more I realized he wasn't protecting us. He was protecting himself. He couldn't bear to see what emotions did to people. His father, my grandfather, was a drunk who used to break things when he was angry. I heard the stories whispered between relatives. Maybe that's why my father built a fortress of silence, to erase that chaos. But in doing so, he erased something else too, the warmth that makes a home feel like home. By the time I turned 12, I'd learned the entire language of silence: how to read a frown before it formed, how to avoid disappointment before it arrived, how to vanish before being seen. It wasn't until years later that I realized when you grow up in a house where emotions are forbidden, you don't just lose your freedom to express, you lose your ability to connect. And that, I think, was the first quiet fracture that would grow into something much darker.
By the time I turned 15, silence had become second nature. I didn't just live inside it, I carried it with me, like an invisible bruise. I could be in a classroom full of laughter, in the chaos of the city bus, and still hear the hush of my father's house echoing in my head. At school, teachers loved me. I always sat straight, never talked back, always did what I was told. Model student, they called me. But what they didn't see was the cost, how every answer I gave was measured, rehearsed, controlled. I didn't speak, I performed. My friends, or whatever passed for friends, would tell jokes, flirt with girls, sneak cigarettes behind the gym. I'd stand a few feet away, smiling at the right moments, but never joining in. There was always this wall inside me, this quiet voice that whispered, "Don't draw attention. Don't be seen." Home hadn't changed. The same quiet dinners, the same perfectly folded napkins, the same air that felt like it could shatter if you breathed too loud. My mother had grown paler, like someone slowly fading from a photograph. My sister, a year younger than me, had started to develop a nervous laugh, the kind that burst out suddenly, then died mid-breath when my father glanced her way. He had rules for everything: how to sit, how to eat, how to greet guests. But his most sacred rule was the one he never said out loud: do not show emotion. Crying was weakness. Anger was disrespect. Happiness was foolish. Everything had to be contained, bottled, sealed tight. And then came the day I broke the first rule. It was late autumn, 1992. The air had that cold smell of rain and dust. I had stayed late at school to work on an art project, a sketch of an old house done in pencil and shadow. It wasn't great, but it was mine. When I brought it home, my mother smiled faintly. She said, "It's beautiful," but her voice trembled when she said it, as if even admiration was something forbidden. That night, during dinner, my father asked what I'd been doing at school. I told him about the sketch. "Art," he said in that slow, precise tone. "Yes, sir. What will art teach you about life?" I hesitated. "It helps me think." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes steady, cold. Thinking is dangerous when it leads to nonsense. He pushed his plate slightly forward, that tiny motion that meant enough of this topic. The air thickened. My sister's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. My mother lowered her gaze. And that's when something in me, something small, fragile, but alive, cracked. "I like it," I said quietly. "It's not nonsense." The silence that followed was like a storm held back by glass. My father's jaw tightened. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just said, "You'll bring that sketch to me after dinner." When I did, he looked at it for maybe 10 seconds. Then he folded it once, then again, until it was a small, crumpled square, and dropped it into the fireplace. I remember the smell of burning graphite, the edges curling in orange flame. I stood there watching my thoughts, my small rebellion, turn to ash. He said, "In this house we build character, not fantasies." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Something inside me burned with that paper. Not anger exactly, more like a strange emptiness. A space that used to hold obedience but now held something raw, sharper. After that night, something changed between us. He must have sensed it. His questions became more precise, his tone colder. He would say things like, "You're quieter than usual." And I'd think, quieter than silence? I started keeping a notebook under my mattress, a secret place where I could write thoughts that would never survive in daylight. I wrote about how our house felt haunted by people who were still alive, how love had turned into something you earned by keeping still. But secrecy breeds fear. One evening, I came home from school and found the notebook on my desk, open. My father stood by the window holding one of the pages. I froze. My mouth went dry. He said, without turning around, "Do you think I'm a monster?" I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even lie. "I didn't mean..." He turned then, slowly, eyes dark and unreadable. "Everything in this house stays in order, even thoughts." He didn't hit me. He didn't have to. He just tore the notebook in half, dropped it on the floor, and said, "You'll thank me someday." That night, I sat awake listening to the rain against the windows. The rhythm reminded me of something I couldn't name. Maybe freedom, maybe grief. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. They had forgotten how. The next morning, my mother came into my room quietly. She didn't look at me, just picked up the torn pages and said softly, "You must be careful." "Why?" I asked. "Because your father doesn't know how to love without control." I remember those words vividly. They stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind like an unfinished song. At school, Ethan noticed the change. He said, "You look tired." I said, "I am." "Your dad again?" I shrugged. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. The silence at home had started to grow roots inside me. I began to hear it even when no one was around, that low hum of restraint, that phantom fear of being too loud, too honest, too human. And yet, a strange thing was happening too. The more my father tightened his grip, the more my thoughts rebelled. I started to imagine speaking back, walking away, running until his voice couldn't find me. I didn't do it. Not yet. But rebellion begins long before the first act. It begins in silence, when the heart starts whispering, "No more." Looking back, I realized that that was the moment when my obedience began to fracture for good. The quiet boy who never questioned, never spoke, was slowly becoming someone else. Someone dangerous, someone who had seen what control could do to love. And once that awareness starts, it doesn't stop.
The following years were quieter, but not in the same way. It wasn't the peace of order anymore. It was the silence of distance. Something invisible had shifted between us. My father must have sensed it, the way animals sense weather changing before a storm. He never spoke of that night, the notebook, the fire, but his eyes began to follow me differently. Not with suspicion, but with a kind of cold anticipation. He had always been predictable. His footsteps on the wooden floor, his cough before entering a room, his precise timing at the dinner table. But after that year, he grew unpredictable in small, unsettling ways. Sometimes he'd come home early and stand in the hallway for minutes before announcing himself. Other times, he'd watch me from the armchair while pretending to read the newspaper. It was like living under a microscope, knowing the lens might shift any second. I started spending more time outside, walking through empty streets, lingering near the closed bookstore where the faint smell of ink and paper still clung to the air. The world felt wider, messier, almost too alive compared to the neat confinement of our house. I'd watch strangers argue, laugh, hold hands, emotions spilling freely, and feel both envy and confusion. How could they show so much without fear? Ethan was still around. He'd grown into someone braver than I ever managed to be. He called me out one afternoon behind the school gym.
"You act like your father's ghost is following you," he said. I laughed nervously. "Maybe it is." He stared at me for a moment. "You know what's messed up? You're the nicest guy I know, but you talk like you're apologizing for existing." That sentence hit harder than he realized. I didn't reply. I just stood there, staring at the cracked cement, wishing I could explain that kindness in our house wasn't something you gave. It was something you earned by staying invisible. That winter, my mother fell ill. Nothing dramatic, just exhaustion, maybe from years of swallowing words. She stayed in bed more often, and my father's tone toward her softened slightly, almost out of fear that her fragility would make him look cruel. He brought her tea, spoke gently, but his eyes stayed the same. He didn't know how to care without controlling. One evening, I overheard them talking in the living room. I was supposed to be asleep, but the walls in our old house were thin. She's whispered, "You're too hard on him." My father replied, "He needs structure." She needs love. I give him discipline. That is love. There was a pause, the kind that hurt more than shouting. I heard her sigh, the bed springs creak as she stood, then the faint sound of a door closing softly, the sound of surrender. After that, something in me began to ache differently. I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I pitied him. His world was made of rules because rules were the only language he understood. He didn't know that love could exist without control. But pity doesn't protect you. One night I came home late. I had gone to Athens to work on a project, but really, I just wanted to sit in a room where laughter wasn't dangerous. When I entered, my father was waiting in the living room. No words, just the belt lying neatly on the table. Not as a threat, but as a symbol. He asked, "Where were you?" "At Ethan's." "Doing what?" "Homework." "Homework ends at 9. I opened my mouth to explain, but stopped. I could feel my pulse pounding behind my eyes. He stood, slowly, almost calmly. "Do you think rules are optional now?" That's when I saw it. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. The fear of losing control. And something inside me broke cleanly this time. "I'm not a child anymore," I said, my voice shaking. He froze for a moment. Neither of us moved. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed the belt, not to use it, but to make sure I remembered it. He held it like a memory, a relic. His voice was steady when he said, "Everything I did to make you strong." I looked at him, really looked. The creases in his forehead, the trembling at the corner of his mouth, the way his knuckles whitened. It wasn't strength. It was fear pretending to be power. I said quietly, "You made me silent." He blinked once, and for the first time in my life, he had no response. The silence that followed wasn't his kind of silence. It wasn't control. It was hollow. He turned away first, went to his study, closed the door. I stood there, staring at the belt. I didn't touch it. I just walked upstairs and closed my door too, but when I did, it felt different this time. It felt like a line being drawn. That night I dreamed of the house as it might have been, filled with laughter, warmth, imperfection. My mother humming in the kitchen, my sister telling a story, my father smiling, not from pride, but from love. The kind of house that could have been ours, if silence hadn't been the only thing we were allowed to share. When I woke, the sun was filtering through the blinds. I could hear my father's footsteps downstairs, slow, measured, familiar. My mother was coughing softly. The same routine, the same rhythm. But something inside me had shifted for good. I knew that if I stayed, I would vanish. Not suddenly, but gradually, piece by piece, until nothing of me remained except obedience. That realization terrified me more than his anger ever had. And so in the weeks that followed, I began to plan. Not rebellion, escape.
I applied for a scholarship in a city 2 hours away. I didn't tell anyone. I just waited silently for the right moment to leave. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I hid it inside one of my old textbooks. My hands were shaking, my heart felt both heavy and light, like freedom carried a weight of its own. But the hardest part wasn't leaving. It was imagining what would happen when he found the silence I left behind. Because in our house, silence had always belonged to him. Now, it would be mine.
The morning I left, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet, orderly, untouched. The curtains drawn to the same height, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and my father's voice murmuring through the newspaper like it was any other day. I waited for him to go upstairs before I slipped the small duffel bag over my shoulder. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from something unfamiliar. Freedom, maybe. My mother stood by the window, her face pale in the cold morning light. She must have known. Mothers always do. She didn't ask where I was going, didn't try to stop me. She just looked at me for a long moment, her eyes wet but calm. Then she said softly, "Write when you can." I nodded. That was our silent agreement, the only rebellion she could afford. As I stepped outside, the sound of the front door closing behind me felt heavier than I'd expected. It wasn't a slam, just a muted thud, like the sound of an ending. The bus ride out of town was quiet. I remember staring at the fields sliding past the window, each one blurring into the next, thinking about how strange it was that the world could keep moving when your entire life was breaking open. In the city, I felt small, and for the first time, it wasn't terrifying. I rented a room near the college, cheap and noisy, with a leaking faucet and a cracked window. But it was mine. No footsteps outside the door, no measured silence between every sentence. I could laugh, cough, breathe, all without permission. For a while, I lived like I was learning to be human again. I'd freeze before speaking too loudly, apologize for things I hadn't done, flinch at sudden noises. But slowly, the world began to soften. I made friends, real ones. They didn't understand the way I hesitated before expressing an opinion or why I apologized for disagreeing. They'd laugh and tell me, "You're too polite." I'd smile, though inside, I was wondering what it felt like to be unafraid of your own voice. It took years to stop checking the clock before eating, years to stop waiting for footsteps on the stairs, years to expect punishment every time I spoke the truth. But the past has a strange way of staying alive, even in the quietest corners. One evening, during my second year, I received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's neat, heavy script. My heart began to race as I read the first line. "Your mother passed away last week." No preamble, no emotion, just fact. I sat there for a long time, unable to move. The city noises outside, the cars, the chatter, the laughter, all blurred into a single distant hum. I had imagined many versions of that moment, but none of them felt like this. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even shocked. Just hollow. The next train home left at dawn. I almost didn't go. But something in me, guilt, love, duty, I couldn't tell, made me pack my bag again. When I arrived, the house looked smaller, shrunken somehow. My father opened the door. He looked older, his posture slightly bent, eyes tired but sharp. For a second, neither of us spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said finally. "I almost didn't." He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Inside, everything was the same. The same furniture, the same curtains, the same silence. Only one thing was missing. Her. The air itself felt emptier without her quiet presence, softening the edges of his rules. We sat across from each other in the living room. The belt was gone from its usual place.
The air between us was thick with all the years we hadn't spoken. "I did what I thought was right," he said quietly, not looking at me. "I know. I didn't mean to hurt you. You did." He closed his eyes, just for a moment. "I wanted you to be strong." "I am," I said, "but not because of you." For the first time, I saw him flinch. Not in anger, but in recognition. Like he finally understood the weight of what he'd built. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't offer to. But when I left that house for the last time, I turned to look at it. Really look at it. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was just an old, quiet building full of echoes. That was the day I stopped hating him. Hate was easy. It gave shape to the pain. But forgiveness was harder. Not the kind that absolves, but the kind that accepts that some people never learn to love without hurting. Years passed. I built a life. A job, a home, a small circle of people who knew nothing of belts or silence. But every so often I'd wake up from a dream where I was 12 again, sitting in that dim living room, waiting for footsteps that never came. And I realized something. The fear had faded, but the obedience lingered in subtle ways. The way I second-guessed my choices, the way I sought approval even when I didn't need it. My father's rules had become ghosts that lived quietly in my habits. Still, I learned to live with them, to make peace with the echoes. One night, long after he'd passed, I went through an old box of letters and found one I'd never opened. It was addressed in his handwriting, dated months before he died. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "Daniel, I used to think silence was peace, that control meant love. But now I see that fear only builds walls, not homes. I wish I had known how to speak without hurting, how to listen without judging. You were always stronger than I was. Maybe that's what I feared most. If there's still time, forgive me. Not for what I did, but for what I couldn't be." I stared at those words for a long time. Then, slowly, I smiled. A small, tired smile. Because maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what happened. Maybe it was about no longer letting it define who I became. I folded the letter and placed it back in the box. Then, for the first time in years, I turned off the lights, opened the window, and let the night air fill the room. The silence that surrounded me this time wasn't his silence, not the silence of fear.